All right, folks, I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the Libertarian Party of the great state of Rhode Island to welcome,
and Providence Plantations,
to welcome Darryl W. candidate for the Libertarian nomination for the presidency of the United States. If we could all give him a big hand. Darryl, why don't you tell us what your website is for the record?
DarrylWperry.com.
Right, and you accept contributions in?
Bitcoin and precious metals.
Precious metals, okay. We will be taking out, we can't, this is Rhode Island, we can't help you too much with Bitcoin here. We are going to be taking up a collection before
I can do an exchange.
Okay. But earlier this evening, Darryl was kind enough to join us live in studio for the Coalition on WPRO AM 630, and we'll be podcasting that as well, and really gave us an education, schooled us, if you will, in the art of freedom and the art of liberty. And it was a defining moment for us here in the party. Because you're the first presidential candidate that's taken the time to come into the state, and we appreciate that. But also because I think you bring home a lot of the issues, the messages, and the virtues that we're trying to pursue here as the newest political party in the state of Rhode Island. So thank you very much for coming in. And I turn the mic and the camera over to you.
Thank you very much, Pat. And thank you for having me. This is actually my second trip ever to Rhode Island. Both of them as part of the presidential campaign. I came down to, I forget what town, Cumberland I think I was, for the Liberty Love Fest back in December, and I enjoyed myself, so I'm going to be back here in Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. I always like throwing that in just because I like knowing odd facts, and the fact that that's the official name of the state, kind of makes me feel smart knowing things. So, as Pat said, I am one of the candidates for the presidential nomination for the Libertarian Party. I believe there's something like 15 people that are seeking the nomination. Seems every couple of weeks somebody's jumping in, and who knows how many candidates there will actually be at National Convention coming up in, I think, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something. The end of the month, so whenever the 26th or the 30th is, minus today. So, yeah, 2 or 3 weeks. And so I realize that Rhode Island has a very small delegation, but there are a couple states that still have some vacancies. So if you're interested in attending as a delegate, there might still be a possibility that you could show up, just might not be as a representative of Rhode Island. So let me talk briefly about why I'm running. And most people will phrase the question differently to say, why do you want to be the president? And I've never said that I wanted to be the president. I said that I'm running for the presidency. And there's a big difference, because when you run for a position, basically you're applying for a job. And sometimes people apply for jobs that they know that they're not necessarily qualified for, but it's a good experience. Other times, it's something because they want to promote an idea, and that's why I'm running for the presidential nomination, is to promote the ideas of liberty. And I've been in the Libertarian Party since 1999. And over the last 17 years, I've seen the party shift from the party of principle that was proudly proclaimed on the website in 1999. Party of principle, to where now the party calls itself fiscally conservative, socially liberal, which kind of makes us sound like we're moderates, but we're not moderates. Libertarians actually stand for something, and that something is libertarianism. That is our principle. And there are some people that they want to water down the message and say, well, we have to give a softer message of liberty so that we can wind up getting a certain vote percentage, or we can win. And I have to ask the question, if you're winning without standing by your actual principles, have you actually accomplished anything? And I personally say no, but it's a question that everybody has to answer for themselves, and I can't answer for anybody other than myself. But when I look at various elections, and I've seen people in New Hampshire that are members of the Libertarian Party that wind up calling themselves Republicans because it's easier to get on the ballot that way. They get elected, and then they wind up not really doing things that libertarians probably should do, like supporting ballot access, or standing up against the party leadership, whether it be from the Republicans or the Democrats, because, well, it's politically expedient to go along to get along, and then I can get reelected, and then in a couple of years, then I can wind up standing on principle. But if you start, compromising your actual principles to wind up, getting ahead, have you actually wound up losing what you believe in? And I would say yes. Which is one reason that I don't compromise what I believe in. I'm certainly willing to compromise on a specific piece of legislation. I'll go to the State House quite frequently to testify for or against various legislation. Some of the stuff that I testify for is nothing that I would personally, if I were a state rep, I would not sponsor the legislation, but I would vote for because it does go towards liberty. And that's really the question of, what you advocate for. 0 being absolute tyranny, 1 being a little bit of tyranny, or a lot of tyranny, depending on how you want to look at it, and then 10 being absolute freedom. Right now, we could argue where we are on the spectrum. I'd say we're closer to 1. Everybody in here would say we're closer to 1 than 10, I believe. So the question is, do we say we want to go to 9, or do we want to go to 10? I say we want to go to 10. Let's do a thought experiment. Imagine that we're all in prison. Like an actual prison, not the metaphorical, like it's a prison without walls. Like, imagine for a moment that we're all in prison. And I come up to you and I say, hey, I've got a brilliant idea. We're going to escape prison. Now, the people that say we should advocate for a 7 or an 8 out of 10 for freedom, how many of those people would then say, okay, yeah, let's break out of prison, but let's go to the prison yard because it's better than being in the cell or the day room? I don't think anybody would say that's a legitimate goal of escaping prison. But that's really what you're doing when you say, let's water down the message of liberty. And instead of saying, have everything be as legal as tomatoes. And I'll explain why I use tomatoes in just a moment if somebody reminds me. But instead of saying everything should be as legal as tomatoes, people say, no, we should tax and regulate things because it's better than what we have. What you're saying is we should break out of prison and then go stay in the prison yard. Because the prison yard's better than the prison cell. And while yes, I agree, because I used to work at a prison and, like being in a cell is not good. I was actually an inmate for about 3 days. Completely victimless crimes and refused to pay the fine, and so sat in the Cheshire County jail for 3 days because the state of New Hampshire allows you to sit in jail and have money deducted off of the fine that they say you owe. So, all right, I could use a vacation, and that's what I did. I would much rather not be in the jail cell. I'd rather, not be in the day room. I'd rather be completely out of the jail. So if we're going to escape, let's escape the whole way. Let's go all the way to 10. Now, why do I say that things should be as legal as tomatoes? I read statute as a hobby because I'm a nerd like that. And I have yet to find the word tomato in state statutes anywhere across the country. Most of the statute sites, they have where you can do a search and type in a keyword. And I have not found any state statute that lists the word tomato. Now, again, survey, how many people would say that tomatoes are a legal substance? Okay, everybody that voted agrees that tomatoes are a legal substance. But they're not in statute. But yet when people talk about legalizing cannabis or legalizing any other thing that's currently an illegal drug, they always say, well, we have to come up with a tax and regulate structure for it. No, you don't. Just make it like tomatoes that are not in statute. So you've got Colorado and Washington and Oregon and Alaska now that have this tax and regulate structure around cannabis. And some people say, well, we need the tax and regulate so that we can then move to completely end the drug war. Well, okay, then you would also need to then tax and regulate, if taxing and regulating is your thing, you would also need to tax and regulate things like crystal meth, which ironically enough, the federal government lists as a Schedule II substance, which means that there is a recognized medical use for. Whereas cannabis and psilocybin are both Schedule 1, meaning that there's 0 recognized medicinal use at the federal level for either of those substances, both of which there are vast amounts of studies that have been done to show that there are medical uses for. I use therapeutic cannabis in violation of state statutes to treat chronic headache that I've had due to post-concussion syndrome. I had probably like 15 concussions. I've had a headache for almost 5 years. Cannabis is one of 2 things that treats the headache. The other being a highly addictive prescription barbiturate that requires another pill to counter the side effects of the barbiturates. So my options are pay a lot of money to a doctor to wind up getting a highly addictive medication that is a lot worse than cannabis, or just find cannabis in a tincture form that I can ingest, because smoking does absolutely nothing to me. Actually, smoking makes the headache worse because you're, like breathing in fumes and, like there's that whole sort of thing. So when I say that I want cannabis legalized, certainly I do have, a personal interest because I don't want to go to jail for treating a medical condition. But I also don't think that anybody should go to jail for possessing a substance that they want to either buy or sell on a consensual basis. Now, there are people that will always bring up, well, what if somebody sells rat poison and says that it's crack? Okay, well, then that person's committing fraud. Not that I'm advocating anybody use crack, or that I advocate anybody ingest rat poison. But if you sell something and you claim that it's something that it's not, that's fraud. You don't need drug laws to prevent that. You just need to, allow people to wind up going to courts, preferably private-run courts, to wind up suing people that have committed fraud against them. Because fraud is a violation of the non-aggression principle. You have no legitimate right to initiate force or fraud. So, this also relates to copyright, which is sort of a contentious issue among libertarians, to where some people will say, we need intellectual property laws because somebody could sell my book and say that they wrote it. Well, that, again, would be fraud. Now, if somebody wants to go to the FedEx Kinko's or Staples and just Xerox your book page for page and then, give that away, I don't know why they would do that, because, you can probably find an electronic version online that you can email somebody a whole lot easier and cheaper, but no fraud has been committed if they just give away a photocopy of something. And if you actually wind up reading the history of copyright law, and, I realize most people probably are not interested in this, but I'll just skim over briefly. The very first in Anglo-Saxon history, the very first copyright dispute was someone back in, I believe it was 368 or 370 something, hand copied a Bible. They worked for somebody, they realized this guy had a Bible, they brought in their own paper and pen, and they just transcribed a copy of the Bible. The guy that owned the actual Bible sued in court and wound up winning a lawsuit claiming that someone making a transcription of his Bible had committed theft against him. And I think everybody can see how ludicrous that actually is. Because he... What's that?
Because God doesn't exist.
Well, I'm not going to debate that, but the guy that transcribed the Bible, he did not deprive the owner of the book from having his book. And that's really what they say, intellectual property is, to protect people from theft. And making copies of things is not stealing anything from anyone. So I'm one of the people that I think that current copyright laws need to be completely re-looked at, if not gotten away from altogether. And I say that as a writer. I write books and I publish my stuff under a Creative Commons license, to where if you want to make copies of it, go for it. Now, if you wind up saying, I wrote this book, chances are I'll never find out, but if I do, then I could file a fraud claim, although I probably, again, never would. But the way I look at every aspect of liberty, no matter what the issue is And I can't take credit for what I'm about to say, so I'll give credit to Ernest Hancock, who always says, freedom's the answer, what's the question? And that's really what it boils down to. No matter what the issue is, freedom's the answer, what's the question? And with that, I will now open it up to questions.
I'll ask a question.
Certainly.
I think I've read on your websites and some of your statements, platform, that your ultimate goal is to abolish government. Is that correct?
I would love to see all coercive governments abolished. As part of the presidential campaign, I'm saying let's just abolish one level, and that level should be the federal government.
Okay.
Because the United States federal government is the cause of, not the solution to, the vast majority of problems that exist in the world today. So you've got a military being run by the U.S. federal government that's killing thousands upon thousands of people around the world every year. I read stories daily of airstrike kills 14, airstrike kills 5, airstrike blows up a wedding in Yemen. There was the thing that happened in October of last year where the U.S. military blew up a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. Military investigated themselves, and I forget if it was earlier this week or last week, determined that no war crime existed because it was not intentional. We meant to blow up this building, we just didn't think that it was a hospital when we blew it up. So we didn't intend to blow up a hospital, so therefore no war crime. Even though 16 people have been relieved of their positions within that division of the military, it was not something that the Pentagon said was a war crime. We've got other things that we know have been war crimes that happened, but the military has never investigated. We can thank Private Manning for the existence of information on a lot of those war crimes. Private Manning being rewarded with 35 years incarceration for basically being a hero. We've got other people like Edward Snowden that leaked a lot of information about the government's doing all of this secret spying that they're not supposed to do. And, well, we've got one presidential candidate from one of the major parties saying that Edward Snowden should be executed. The other candidate has not actually, or the other presumptive nominee has not actually come out with an official statement, but something along the lines of he should return and face trial. And as we know from the Manning trial, there's no way you can have a fair trial when you're charged with espionage. You're not allowed to present a defense. We know this from other people that have been charged with espionage. Thomas Drake being a perfect example, who somehow, without the ability to actually present a defense, wound up winning the trial against him for espionage because he leaked information after trying to go through the proper channels that they say that Manning and Snowden should have gone through. Thomas Drake went to Senate subcommittee hearings and said, here's information, and they said, we don't care. But here's information on illegal stuff that you're doing. Yeah, we don't care. All right, you don't care, somebody will. He leaked the information, wound up getting charged with espionage. Wound up somehow miraculously beating those charges. And now we've got Edward Snowden that a lot of top U.S. officials are saying he fled to Russia. Well, no, Snowden wasn't trying to stay in Russia. Snowden was trying to get to Ecuador, and the only way he could do that was to fly through Russia. U.S. government shuts off his passport and revokes it and tells everybody if he flies over airspace of any of our allies, we will take the plane down and evacuate everybody off the plane or shoot the plane down. So the U.S. government caused Edward Snowden to stay in Russia, and now they're saying, why are you in Russia? Well, because you made me stay here. And you know, there's absolutely no way that Snowden or any whistleblower can ever get a fair trial. So to say he should come home and face a trial is basically akin to saying he should be executed. And that's absolutely horrible. I think all charges against Snowden should be dropped immediately. Whistleblowers like Private Manning should be pardoned and given an apology. Personally, not one of these, you know, like handwritten with the pardon, but should, you know, like the President of the United States, whoever that should be, should walk into the prison cell and say, Private Manning, I am sorry for everything that happened. You are free to go. You've got people like Ross Ulbricht, who is sitting in jail for, I believe it's 2 life sentences plus 40 years for operating a website. That website allowed people to buy and sell substances that are not exactly legal in most jurisdictions, but it removed a layer of violence from the black market by allowing people to get the substances delivered to their house, and they knew exactly what they were getting because people were allowed to leave comments on the seller's profile to where they could say, yes, this was exactly what he said that it was. Or, he said it was 100% pure, I had it tested, it was 97. Whereas, on the street, you go buy something that one week might wind up being 80% pure, the next week might be 100%, the week after that it might be 50, and people that are using illegal substances, you know, they don't exactly have labs that they can go to on the street corner to get stuff tested, so they're basing the current dose off of whatever the previous dose was. The last dose may have taken 2 doses to wind up getting the high that they wanted, and then they use that same dose. Well, this time they've got a more pure substance, or they've got a tainted substance, and that's how overdoses happen. And you did not have that sort of thing happening with people buying stuff off of the Silk Road because they knew exactly what they were getting. Any more questions? Yes.
So, little devil's advocate here. As libertarians, we generally believe in a non-interventionist foreign policy.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we haven't had influence over the past however many decades of foreign policy. How do you resolve the problems that we've incurred on ourselves over a interventionist foreign policy and promote a non-interventionist foreign policy when we've already stirred up the hornet's nest, if you will?
Right, and I'm guessing that you're talking specifically about a lot of the problems in the Middle East.
Middle East, yes.
And I'm glad that that's exactly what you were talking about, because I've got a very good analogy for what is going on in the Middle East. And actually the entire global war on terror. The global war on terror is basically a drunken bar fight, but instead of beer bottles and bar stools, it's cruise missiles and, you know, other horrible weapons that wind up killing thousands of people. And just like with a bar fight, nobody remembers who threw the first punch. Nobody remembers when the first punch was thrown. They just know, well, punches were thrown, bar stool came by my head, so I'm just going to keep swinging and throwing things. And the only way to win a bar fight is to not be involved in the bar fight. You've got to stop throwing punches, and eventually punches will stop being thrown. Same way with the global war on terror. You need to stop throwing missiles. You need to stop throwing bombs. You need to, stop being involved in creating the enemy, basically. And that's really what's happening when you've got the military dropping missiles on weddings. And there's a statistic came out not too long ago where the military, after investigating themselves, figured out that 90% of the people that are killed in what are called targeted drone strikes, meaning that the military, at the time they launch the strike, they supposedly know who is the target of the strike. 90% of the people that are killed in targeted strikes are civilians. And that's really hard to believe, only because the definition of civilian is so damn narrow that they consider every able-bodied man over a certain age to be a suspected terrorist, and now they're saying 90% of the people that are killed are civilians. So when you are killing civilians, of course that's going to wind up making people upset. Because the global war on terror is, by its very nature, a war that can never be won because you're using terror in order to fight terror. And I always like making sure that I mention terrorism because that's what the U.S. military does. And that's the textbook definition of terrorism, is the use of force for political or social goals. And that's what the military is doing. They're using force to bring about either political or social goals. And when the government writes their definition of terrorism, they always have to throw in some kind of word to where it doesn't sound like they're committing acts of terrorism. but no matter how you define it, that's exactly what governments do. There have been quotes in various media outlets from people in Yemen and Libya and Somalia where they've said every time the US military drops one of these bombs and kills somebody, they recruit 10 people to fight against them. So the only way to win the global war on terror, much like the only way to win a bar fight, is to not be involved. So how do you stop being involved? Well, you just stop being involved. As Ron Paul said, we just marched in, let's just march out.
Right. And I agree with you on that. The problem is the other side has to apply the same rules so they don't stop. So how do we, like, what's our response to that? Do we take it just a purely defensive posture and wait till, and eventually they will stop coming, or do you?
Right, and right now most of the fighting, it's this preemptive, well, we have to fight them over there so that we don't fight them over here. And that's like saying, I have to go kill my next door neighbor to make sure he doesn't break into my house. So, you know, like, just stop. And then take that purely defensive posture to where if something happens, then you respond.
If I could switch gears, what's your path to ridding the United States of the Fed?
By Fed, you mean Federal Reserve or Federal Government?
Sorry, yes, the Reserve.
So there's a lot of different ideas on how to do that. Some people say we need to audit the Fed and then we can wind up ending it. And the way I look at it, it's a lot simpler than that. And it's really something that I'm surprised nobody else has ever really looked at. All you have to do is get rid of the legal tender laws. The law is saying that you must use the pieces of paper that the federal government has contracted the Federal Reserve to wind up issuing. So you get rid of the legal tender law, and then people like Bernard von Nothaus, who minted their own coins, would not wind up being charged with bogus counterfeit charges because what he minted looked too much like something that the US Mint may have put out at some point in its history. And I think that if you want to make up your own dollar bills backed by the full faith and credit of you should be allowed to do that. And then it would be up to anybody to decide if they want to accept that. But the thing about the legal tender laws, most people don't realize there were no legal tender laws in the United States until the tyrant Lincoln had Congress pass a legal tender law so that he could inflate the currency because he needed to pay for his war. So he had the Treasury issue Treasury notes, and nobody wanted to accept those when they first came out. So that was Congress, all right, pass a law telling people they have to use them. And that's where the legal tender law came in. So there's this popular conspiracy theory that Lincoln was assassinated for opposing central bankers, but Lincoln created a central bank of sorts. He just had it being operated by the government instead of a private entity. Not that it really makes any difference because it's still backed by force. I think somebody over here had a question.
Yeah, so I'm a concerned citizen, and I struggle with voting my conscience, which is more like a third party, versus sending a message, which would be more like Trump. Why would I want to go third party when I really want to send a message and I'm pissed off? I'm needing Trump.
You live in Rhode Island?
Right here, right in the street.
When's the last time Rhode Island went for a Republican? No, that's a serious question.
No, you're right.
Reagan.
Reagan? Okay, so chances are Rhode Island's probably going Democrat again.
Went Bernie. That's a little bit of a message.
And Bernie's also a Democrat. So
Not really.
He's running in the Democratic Party for the Democratic nomination. He's a Democrat.
Here, I'll pay for it.
My point being, Rhode Island's a fairly safe state for the Democrats, so you're free to vote your conscience. If your conscience says vote for a big government Republican, then by all means vote for a big government Republican. If your conscience is vote for the Green Party because you like what Jill Stein has to say, then vote for the Green Party because you like Jill Stein. If your conscience is vote for the Libertarian because the Libertarian actually supports liberty, then vote for the Libertarian because that's what you believe. I'm not going to try to persuade you one way or the other of what your conscience should be. but I will say that statistically, the chances of your vote being the deciding vote one way or the other are akin to winning every Powerball that's ever happened ever throughout history simultaneously while being struck by lightning in an airplane that's crashing out of the sky being hit by a meteor.
That's what I need to hear. Absolutely.
Can I just jump in as a point too? What's critical here to this election, if we get, and this is a guess, based on prior year's results, 25,000 votes for the Libertarian nominee, then the Libertarian Party becomes an official ballot party here in the state of Rhode Island, with all the rights and privileges afforded. Now, to us, we've actually already had a
And that's huge because then that makes it easier for people that want to run for state rep, state senate, Congress.
You've got the opportunity. It's funny because one of the things that other third parties have talked about is, well, you get money from the state. Well, as a group, we've already kind of, we bounce it around. We don't want their freaking money, but what we want is an opportunity. In fact, we'll take their money, and we've actually had an independent poll amongst us as to how we would take their money, and return it to them through an alternative cavity. Okay, so, but excuse me, it gives us a pulpit to make a statement. All of a sudden, they can't dismiss us anymore. We're on the ballot, we're here, and we're here to make a point. So the great point that you have an opportunity to contribute to is a party that stands up for personal liberty, has no desire for personal gain, and is here to espouse your individual rights. And to me, this came out of nowhere. This is years of, when we first got together 6 months ago, pre-Clinton, pre-Trump, pre-all of it, we had no idea this. We were talking maybe 4, 6, 7, 8 years down the road, we'll get a shot at this. Just, it's a roll of the dice. All of a sudden, 25,000 votes gives you a legitimate way to stick a political index figure nowhere.
No, that's huge. Thank you. I didn't, obviously, I clearly wasn't breaking it down to that level.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the ballot access thing because that's something that's different state to state. Where I live in New Hampshire, it doesn't matter what vote percentage the presidential candidate gets, that does not affect ballot access. So the Libertarian could win New Hampshire and the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire would still not have ballot status unless the gubernatorial or U.S. Senate candidate got over 4%. So, like that's something that I'm glad you brought up because there's a lot of misinformation about what certain vote thresholds mean. There's some people that say, well, we need to make sure that the presidential nominee gets 5% and then we get ballot status everywhere and we get this money. And, well, one, no, the 5% doesn't give us ballot status everywhere. And two, I would love to do the same thing with the money that you're proposing. To quote one of my favorite pro wrestlers, The Rock, gonna take that check, shine it up real nice, turn that sumbitch sideways and shove it up your candy ass. That's what we should do with their tax money.
Right, because it's not ours.
Next question.
You seem to show support for maybe some voting getting people ballot access through how many votes a national candidate gets or a statewide candidate, or whichever way. Is pragmatism valuable to that end? To getting a ballot access as well as getting someone who's at least partially libertarian in a debate to kind of promote us?
As long as I've been in the party, I've seen people that have done the pragmatist campaign because they say, well, if I just soften the message enough, then I'll get X% of the vote and we'll get ballot status. And they've not done any better measurably, it's not been measurably better than people that have run very purist libertarian campaigns. I've even seen within the same election, people in different districts for, say, a state rep office. One person running a pragmatist, I'm going to sound like a Republican that likes weed, and somebody else saying, I'm going to sound like a libertarian, and they wind up getting the same vote percentage. So there's no real historical precedent that running a watered down message gets you more votes. If anything, it just, gets people confused about what libertarians actually are. Like, there's already people that think that libertarians are just Republicans that like weed. And, there certainly are some former Republicans in the Libertarian Party that like weed, but we're so much more than that. We're so much more than just low taxes and let's smoke weed.
So do you think there's value in, now when I started off as a libertarian, I wasn't a pure libertarian. I align almost exactly with you now. In areas I consider myself a pragmatist. So do you think there's value in opening the party to these people?
There's value in welcoming the people into the party, but I don't think you welcome somebody into the party and then say, and by the way, here's the keys to the car, go be our spokesman now. Which is what a lot of people have wanted to do over the last decade or so. A couple of those people who will remain nameless, but they were the 2008 presidential ticket, have since left the Libertarian Party and gone back to the Republicans because they realized that they could not redefine libertarian to mean conservative. And there's a couple of people that are in the party now that are still trying to do the same thing of, we need to redefine libertarian to mean conservative. And libertarian and conservative are two completely different terms for very, different reasons. Just like, decades and decades ago, libertarian and liberal kind of meant the same. So, there's a lot of libertarians that will call themselves classic liberals because the word libertarian has a lot closer connection to liberal than it does conservative. But it's been this sort of thing, I would say probably since the late 70s, early 80s, that there's been this confusion about libertarian and conservatives. And some of that blame goes to Ronald Reagan, who famously said the heart and soul of conservatism is libertarianism. And a lot of people are like, oh yeah, so libertarian, conservative. Just makes sense. So I welcome people into the party as long as they're willing to learn what the ideology is. But if you come into the party and you try to change the ideology of the party, then no, I'm not going to welcome you with open arms. Yes, Pat?
I mean, is it fair to say we're not just a party, we're a belief system?
Exactly. We're a party built on a belief system. And that's something that separates us from the two major parties, that they're parties that have beliefs. It's not a belief system, it's a belief of we're not the other people. Like that's their sole thing, is we're not the other people. And where they do differ, it's on very minuscule things of the tax rate should be 35%. No, the tax rate should be 39%. And anybody that says taxation is theft gets looked at like, oh, you must be crazy. Okay, let's go back and listen to these two people argue over a 4% difference of how much theft should occur.
Well, I was going to ask a question. I know that libertarianism isn't only about freedom, but it's also about justice.
Right.
I just want to run this scenario behind you because I know you're a fairly radical libertarian, so I want to hear your answer. Suppose somebody comes to your house, steals something, and runs away, and you're not sure who they are, and they disappear. You mentioned private courts, etc., but supposing this person doesn't want to show up to a private court, who has the right to use force to seek justice against this individual who has done harm to you?
Well, let me ask, in your hypothetical scenario, what was stolen? Because if they came in and stole, like my toaster strudels, I'm not going to care.
Your shotgun collection, let's say.
Okay, well, something like that, obviously, like there's obvious value to it.
Right.
Do we know if the person still has it 3 days later, or is it something that they, sold? Well, so there's a lot of questions that need to be looked at of how practical is it? Is there security footage? Do we know what the person looks like? Or is it just one of these wild goose chase sort of things of, well...
Suppose you find this person, but you say, I want you to come to my private court to seek retribution, or,
Okay, is this person... Well, let me ask this.
This person saying, I'm not showing up to your private court.
Are they offering a different court to show up to, or are they just saying, I'm not doing it?
I'm not doing it.
Well, in that case, there would probably, and this is one of the things that whenever libertarians talk about, like in an ideal world, things would not be run by government, they then have to answer all of these, gotcha scenarios.
I'm just trying to create gotcha.
Right, I know.
Right.
I'm just saying, I don't know exactly how the private courts would work, but there would probably be some kind of procedure, just like now with the government-run courts. If somebody refuses to show up, you can be ruled against in absentia. I'm sure something similar would happen in private courts, to where if you know for certain, like there's video, here's screenshot of my security camera, it's this guy, and he's holding my stuff.
Right.
So like there's indisputable proof of who it is, and that's your stuff.
Right.
I'm fairly certain there would be procedures to where somebody could be found guilty in absentia, and then the question is, who then uses the defensive force to retrieve your stuff or get your restitution, and at what point does it no longer become defensive force and it becomes initiatory? So like if it's 20 years down the road and you're like, I finally found the guy, well, what's the statute of limitation? And that's why there are statute of limitations on things today.
Right.
Because, if you steal a pack of bubble gum when you're 5, it would be completely unjust to throw you in jail today for something you did 40 years ago.
But justice does imply at some point force. If this person doesn't recognize your court, has your guns, and presume you got the right person, maybe not his twin brother, at the end of the day, there may be force involved unless we just accept the fact that, hey, you didn't do a good job of protecting your guns. Snooze, you lose.
Right, and that's where the sort of thing of, at what point does it become no longer defense and it becomes initiatory, and that's something that's up for debate, because there are some people that say if an 8-year-old girl steps on your flowers, you're completely justified in blowing her head off, and I would say you're absolutely insane if you think that's the way that you should respond.
Right.
But oddly enough, you kind of stole my question, but from a minarchist perspective, minarchists mostly believe that basic structure for the court system and the simple construct of justice and whatnot. So I guess what do I say here? The point where a person steals your stuff, at what point do they surrender their protection of the non-aggression principle at that point, right? They've committed a crime.
Right, so if you commit an act of aggression, then somebody is within their rights to use defensive force.
But more importantly, that, and often we get challenged as libertarians with those specific questions.
Right.
There is so much more before we get to that stage to argue about and to solve, so many more problems to solve, that at what point do we say, look, don't worry about that, we'll get there. If we ever get to that point, we'll deal with it then. Right now, we have to worry about taxation and all the other.
Right, and there are some people that are minarchists that they believe that government should run the courts. Right. And as long as the courts were only, let's imagine for a moment that we are in this minimal government thing to where the maximum role is protection of life, liberty, and property. And it's disputable or debatable whether or not courts would fall within that. But let's in this scenario say that they are. And, okay, well, somebody commits an act of aggression, they go to the court. Then again, we have to have the same discussion of, well, what if they say they're not going to the government-run court? Well, there's procedures, and I think the same thing would happen in free market. But then there's also if the police are not wasting their time on victimless offenses, which the last time I looked at statistics for the tiny little city of Keene, New Hampshire that I live in that has about 20,000 people, 68% of the citations and arrests were for victimless offenses. So drunk in public, open container, parking offenses, speeding offenses, driving, and various other things where there's no victim, drug possession, drug sales. So if the police are no longer spending their time and energy on those victimless offenses, they would have more time to just make a random pass through somebody's neighborhood. And then in places like Detroit, where you've got the threat management centers, in the neighborhoods that the threat management center actually patrols on a fairly regular basis, the crime rate's down because people know, oh, yeah, somebody is actually paying attention to what's going on here. And then, nobody's going to wind up breaking into your house if they know there's a chance they're going to get caught. And if they never know when some, private security guy is rolling through the front yard or rolling down the street, they're going to think twice or 3 times about doing something. That's why a lot of times just a sign in the front yard saying protected by Brinks is a good deterrent. Whether you actually have the security system or not, the sign is a deterrent a lot of times. So, there's other things in addition to the court. So there is that private security, there's the function of the police. If they're not distracted with all of these victimless things, they can actually go after the victimizers, and then the courts wouldn't be as crowded with things that are basically money-making ventures. So they would have a lot more time to actually punish people properly or make sure that they're getting the right people, instead of right now it's all about making sure that the prosecutor gets a win. The prosecutor doesn't care whether they have the right person. They care about whether or not I get the win. Do I have a mark under the win column or the loss column? Oh, we got the guy to take a plea. And that's what happens 90-some-odd% of the time, to where they threaten somebody with a large amount of time in jail. Listen, if you take the plea, we'll drop it down, and then you can do this and that, and you never go to jail, and you just pay a fine. And the vast majority of times, even when somebody is innocent, because basically it's a gamble. Do you roll the dice on, I'm going to be able to convince the judge or the jury that I did not do what they say I did? Or do you go ahead and say, yes, I did it, you get something on your record, but then you don't go to jail, and you know that you, quote unquote, win your freedom?
That's why I think the right to self-protection is so important, right? If you have a right to protect yourself, it's a deterrent from someone aggressive upon you.
Right.
Completely 180, switching gears, the Free State Project, since you're from New Hampshire, what's your thoughts on that, and do you support it?
I moved to New Hampshire for the Free State Project. The Free State Project being a movement to get 20,000 people that love or strongly like the ideas of liberty, that would sign a statement saying that they intend to move to New Hampshire to exert the fullest practical effort towards the creation of a society where the maximum role of government is protection of life, liberty, and justly acquired property. And Free State Project back in February hit the goal of 20,000 signers. So they've shifted the goal to 20,000 movers, and people are starting to, well, people were already moving. There were about, I think, 1,600 movers prior to them hitting the 20,000 signers. So more people are moving. And I honestly don't think you need 20,000 people to move to New Hampshire to wind up getting a lot more freedom. There's already been some success with only that, 1,500 movers in New Hampshire. Several years ago, I forget the exact year, Free Stater that was elected as a state rep got elected as a Republican because, well, that's just easier. But this woman was an EMT. And she realized that one of the knives that she carried on the job as an EMT, it was illegal for her to have when she got off the clock. So she looked at the statutes and she said, these are horrible, let's repeal them. And she was able to wind up repealing all of the knife laws in New Hampshire, with the exception of the weapons law as it applies to former felons. So the only people in New Hampshire that are still prohibited from owning or possessing knives of any size are felons, and then it's if it falls under the deadly weapon category. So there's definitely work that needs done in New Hampshire, but there's things that have already happened there as well. So I would love to see all of you liberty lovers from Rhode Island make the short drive a couple hours north and relocate there.
We'll support you. We'll fight our fight here.
Well, one of the worst state reps in the state of New Hampshire is actually from Rhode Island, and I would gladly trade her back. In exchange, I think we need a statist exchange program to where we send the big government lovers that live in New Hampshire to a state in exchange for somebody that loves liberty. Consensually, of course. But yeah, so there's good things that are happening, but we certainly need help.
Staying on the topic of the Free State Project, just briefly, when people started to move, I noticed that some state reps started to speak out about this. The state reps that spoke out, was that a pretty good indicator of who needed to be targeted for removal?
Yes. Cynthia Chase is the state rep that made, she was one of the first to make a statement to the effect of she believes the Free State Project is the greatest threat to the state that currently exists, and she actually lives in my city. She moved to New Hampshire in 2006, and apparently she thinks it's okay to move to a state and bring your big government with you, but it's not okay to move to a state and want to have less government. So I find the hypocrisy a little glaring there, where she's like, I can move, but you can't. And I'm happy to report that while she did not lose her last election, she is definitely vulnerable. She won by 50 votes. So the guy that ran against her was 51 votes shy of dethroning one of the worst state reps in the state. And there actually are people that make the list. The New Hampshire Liberty Alliance, every year they put out the legislator report card. And they have reps rated A+ through F. And then there's constitutional threat and dereliction of duty. Dereliction of duty being people that doesn't matter how good they vote, they missed over a certain percentage of votes, so therefore they should be removed. Constitutional threat means that they voted the right way less than 15% of the time. So there's definitely the list of here's people that should be targeted, and because we have 400 state reps in a state of 1.3 million people, it's rather difficult to find enough people to step forth to target all of the bad ones. It's hard enough to find people to step forward to run for the seats that are very easy to where you're the only person on the ballot, so therefore you win. So again, we need people.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I think on your website you've advocated for zero or voluntary taxes.
Yes.
So there's two parts to this question. If so, wouldn't that completely defund the government as we know it, so we would not have
That's
a government?
the goal. Well, the goal is to completely defund it and require everything that the government provides to be funded on a completely consensual basis. So I think everybody in here would agree that roads are a good idea. Although I
Privatized.
right, well, you don't necessarily need to quote unquote privatize the roads, because that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So to some people that means you contract with a single company and they take over the roads, like what's happened with a lot of the supposed private prisons.
Right.
But businesses, we're in a business right now, they have an incentive to make sure that customers are able to show up to this establishment.
Right.
And originally, roads were built by the businesses so that people could get from town to wherever the business was.
Right.
So absent government, taking money out of your the fuel, so I think the last number I saw, it's on average about 42 cents per gallon goes to tax. So absent government taking all of that to then pave the roads, businesses have an incentive to make sure that there's roads. And again, I don't know exactly how it would work in a free society, but we should actually allow a freer society to exist so that we can see how it will work. And schools, people like schools, and schools would be funded. There's already a lot of private schools that exist, and you can get a very good education for free online right now. But there's, the benefit of having people meet in person to wind up learning certain things. And absent government funding of education, you would have private charities step forward to wind up creating community schools that are open to anybody within a geographic area. It just would not be funded using taxation. Libraries are something else that people like and would fund. Art museums, and art museums are probably the easiest thing to get people to accept, because right now most people are told, well, absent the National Endowment for the Arts, art museums across the country would shut down, which is absolutely absurd, because art museums on average get somewhere between 10 to 25% of their funding through tax dollars, meaning that there's not a lot of their funding that they would have to make up if you got rid of the tax funding going to art museums. And I hate that the town that I live in doesn't have a good art museum. They've got a art gallery on the campus of Keene State College, and it's not that good of one. But when I lived in bigger cities, I used to go to art museums all the time, and I would gladly pay the recommended donations or more because I loved what they provided. And absent that 10 to 25% of their funding coming through taxation, they would very easily be able to make that up by recommending a slightly higher donation, or just charging admission, or selling more stuff in their gift shop, which is how they make a lot of their money now. So things would exist, things that currently exist would still exist absent government funding of stuff. And the last time the government quote unquote shut down, the feds actually started paying park rangers to stand on sidewalks to say, I'm sorry, the sidewalk is closed. So, absent government funding the National Park Service, there would not be anybody standing on the sidewalk saying, I'm sorry that the sidewalk is closed, you can't walk down the sidewalk to see this thing that's in open air. And then, people would say, well, what about Yellowstone, or what about the Grand Canyon? Well, there's a lot of environmental protection groups that would wind up stepping forward to wind up making sure that those things still exist. The Audubon Society is a perfect example of a private charity that wants to preserve nature, that they're incentivized to wind up keeping parks around, and people like parks. And the National Park Service right now, you can't just go to Yellowstone, you've got to pay an admission fee. So it's being funded by taxation, but there's still this fee. If the Audubon Society were running Yellowstone, they'd still charge a fee. The only difference would be who's actually running it. So you would still have things. It would just be funded voluntarily, not coercively. The largest difference would probably be in the way the military operates, because they wouldn't have unlimited resources to just go around and kill everybody because.
There was a second half of my question. I mean, libertarianism in its purest form, do you think it actually sort of points the way to anarchy? And I don't mean that as a pejorative term, but do you think that ultimate, the purest form of libertarianism leads to anarchy, like a total?
Absolutely. If you take the ideas of liberty, that you own yourself, that you don't have the right to initiate force or fraud against another person for any reason, then taking that to its logical conclusion, you have to assume that voluntarism is the ultimate end. Voluntarism being the idea that all human interaction should be completely consensual.
Okay.
So, there are people within the Libertarian Party that think that I should not be allowed to be a member of the party because I take libertarian philosophy to its logical conclusion.
Right.
Of there should not be any government that people do not consent to.
Right.
And so I'm a big advocate for polycentric societies, meaning many centers, to where you only have the government that you consent to, and government should not be tied to geography, and geography should not be tied to a government. And there's actual historical precedent for polycentric civilizations. It existed in Ireland for a couple thousand years. It existed in the Middle East for a long time, before, during, and slightly after the life of Prophet Muhammad. where you had Christians, pagans, Jews, and Muslims all living amongst one another in the same cities, living next door to one another, but like their governance was not tied to the geography.
And yet you're working within a state-sponsored process of parties and elections to bring about the change that would ultimately be the end of.
Well, I'm working within the system to spread an idea, and that's really the point. The point, if I wanted to, quote unquote, win an election, I would water down my message, I would change everything I believe in, and I would join either the Republicans or Democrats, and then I could get elected, but for what? The only reason anybody should ever run for political office is to spread an idea. And for me, that idea is the idea of liberty. And I think that's it. I don't see any other questions, so I'll just make a closing comment to the camera. If you want to learn more about the campaign or to donate to the campaign, you can go to darrylwperry.com. That's DARRYLWperry, PERRY.com, darrylwperry.com.